Ottawa, good guy, smart, drinks beer, tells inappropriate jokes regularly. Thank you for coming. Clearly, Vern and I have a bit of history, and he gave me carte blanche to introduce him in any fashion I wished, so I did. I didn't mention he also sails boats. Where I first met Vern was actually at the Royal College Examination Board, where we worked together at the high stakes level for examining anesthesia residents across the country. I was impressed by his enthusiasm. I was impressed by his tenacity and dedication towards education and introducing very high quality floor to impress us. Thank you.
Very kind, Rich. Just getting things up here. Thank you very much for having me here, as these guys are working on getting my thing going here. It's a pleasure to come down here. This is my third trip this year, so I'm getting very familiar with London International Airport. And be a part of, as you guys try and work on bringing together what I know is going to be a massive collaborative. In fact, one of the ways that I like to get introduced is that I run one of the largest simulation centers in Canada, but I know that after we have a successful day here that I won't be able to say that because I think that'll probably reside here. Having said that, my wife tells me that size doesn't matter, so I'm going to switch over here and we're going to run off here. Okay, perfect. It's on that one? Okay. So again, welcome and thank you for giving me the opportunity here. We'll see that everything works off of the PC okay. The goal of the talk today is to edutain you a bit, to get your juices flowing and get you in the right frame of mind so that we can have a productive day. Going to talk a little bit about how education's changing, particularly in medicine, but clearly it's going to come to all the healthcare professionals moving away from a time-based approach. Discuss some of the rationale for simulation. We heard a little bit of it from the Vice President. And of course, more importantly, talk about why you're all here together and how simulation can be leveraged for patient safety through collaboration. Now, as Rich said, both he and I are anesthesiologists, and you don't really need to be an anesthesiologist to recognize this as one of the first anesthetics ever given at the Harvard Ether Dome. Now, what I was surprised to learn when I moved from the U of T to University of Ottawa is that several people in this picture are still practicing in Ottawa, maybe in London too. I don't think you need to be an anesthesiologist to realize that medicine's come light years from here, right? Gone is the doctor with the little black bag making house calls with the little girl, and he's been replaced by a modern day physician who doesn't even care for patients by themselves, cares for patients in teams, has a host of different devices at their disposal, that iPhone, that BlackBerry, and we could probably debate all day whether that thing around her neck is very useful as ultrasound becomes more prominent. And I'm a bit of a geek. So I know that, that medicine will continue to advance, right? To the age of Star Trek, an age of tricorders and needles don't have needles on them. And even though our medical science has come this far, I'm going to argue that our medical education hasn't made it quite as far. Look at this graduating medical school class from many moons ago and contrast that to any graduating class that you probably have in Fanshawe and Western and any of your facilities. Doesn't look very different, does it? In fact, healthcare education really hasn't changed very much in a century. Does anyone know Abraham Flexner? Few people in the front. Abraham Flexner, a very famous man, commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation to reform medical school and healthcare education across North America. And basically the things that he wrote are still with us. Healthcare education should be under auspices of a higher education like universities and colleges. And there should be some sort of pre-clinical training followed by clinical training. Sounds pretty familiar to what we do, right? The bottom line is our basis of healthcare education is still this see one, do one apprenticeship model, right? And I can't knock it too much because then I'd be knocking the training that a lot of us in this room have had. And I'd like to think that we're still competent. But that education's been called into question, and it's been compared to tea steeping. Now, if you'll bear with the analogy, that's where you take bright young students or tea leaves, you put them in a training program for 3, 4, 5 years, or hot water, and somewhere in the end of that 3, 4, 5 years, you get a competent practicing healthcare worker, or tea. And this whole time-based T-steeping formula has been called into question across all of our disciplines, not just by our students, not just by educators, but by the government itself. And the reason that it's been called into question, because it did work, right? None of us in this room are incompetent, is because we probably have new barriers to healthcare education that we didn't have when you and I were training, right? When John was training. In fact, I'd argue that healthcare education has come further in the last decade than it has in the last century. We have knowledge and technology that we assume is doubling every 6 to 8 years, right? We don't even cut people open to do surgery anymore. How are we going to teach all of those things, plus the doubling that's happening every 6 to 8 years? We have fiscal restraints. As I told a lot of people, I'm becoming more hospital administrator-like by the day. And one of those jobs is telling people to get people through the clinics faster, get them through the operating room faster. Well, that model of healthcare delivery is in direct conflict with healthcare education, because we know that things done by trainees take longer and cost more money. How many of you are dealing with work hour reform? A little bit. A few people, a few hands coming up. Well, for those of you who aren't dealing with it, let me tell you what happened in Quebec. Does anyone know what happened in Quebec? A few people. This is for the doctors, but I'm sure applies to a lot of the healthcare workers. Well, the resident trainee physicians in McGill University sued McGill, told them being on call for 24 hours in a row is against their human rights. That went to a binding arbitrator. And guess what the arbitrator found? Yeah, being on call for 24 hours in a row is against one's human rights. And they didn't just order that change at McGill University, but they ordered that it change across the entire province of Quebec. Now, the debate continues to rage nationally with varying opinions, but I'm going to tell you, it's no longer a question of if it's going to come to your program, it's when it's going to come to your program. We have ethical concerns, and that comes first from our students who are telling us that they'd be more unwilling to do things that they're not familiar with, things we would never have said, but also from the patients, right? Because they used to get their information about doctors and nurses from shows like these, right? Showed the doctor is all-knowing, infallible. Let's contrast that with shows today. Shows that where most of the plot lines are the mistakes that doctors or nurses are making. And even though we can argue about whether these shows are rooted in reality, we have to agree that they're marginally truthful. In fact, the only way I think they really go into fiction is they always depict the surgeons as the best looking doctors when we know it's the anesthesiologists. And lastly, how many of you have teenagers? All right, and when you left them on Thursday night, because I know they weren't doing homework on Friday night, where were they doing their homework? Like you and I did it? Up in our room, fluorescent light over our table, studying? No. Front of the TV, iPod on in their ears, texting their friends at the same time, laptop open. We have a different generation of learner. And we need to appreciate the millennial generation, Generation Y, not call them Generation Wine, like I know we have a tendency to do, and ask ourselves, what about Generation Y are we going to do different? And appreciate that every generation that comes after it worries about the next one. Who knows when this cartoon was taken? It's from 1941 in Life magazine. So this is not a new concept, worrying about the generation behind us. And instead of wondering whether or not they're going to be okay and have the social consciousness and all these things we need, we have to stop asking ourselves, are they really listening when they've got these laptops open, maybe when you walk around the classroom and see the Facebook page open, and instead say, we've lost that battle, and we need to now change our learning to embrace the different learner as opposed to fighting against this trend. The millennial generation has its strengths, and we need to embrace them. They're natives of the information age. They're team players. They're confident. They have a social conscience that we haven't seen in the last decade, and they're optimistic. Now, if all of those pull factors aren't going to get you to change your education, let me do a push factor. And this has come down in the United States to medical education, at least. And that's where Congress, because they like to fight, stands up and says, prove to me that this $13.4 billion healthcare education industry trains doctors to a given competency. And when nobody could stand up and say, well, we're not really sure, and we don't have the proof, they said, well, then maybe I'm not going to keep funding this. It's forced the entire accreditation system in the United States, residency education, to take a hard look at itself and develop an outcomes-based approach. So now we've got the pull factors and the push factors. At the Royal College, we're following suit from our brethren to the south of the 49th, and we too are embracing an outcomes-based approach to physician training. I suspect that the same thing will come to all healthcare training, as opposed to the old time-based, you did fine, attaboy, you're out of here. Now, the other problem we have is that our communities are telling us that being a doctor, being a nurse, being a healthcare worker is more than to center this flower, right? It's more than just about being a medical expert. The CanMed's framework for what it takes to be a competent physician is the first framework that brought together people from the community and changed from a healthcare worker focused approach to education to a community or patient-centered approach. We didn't say that we needed all these things. This is what our patients said we needed. And we've had this for specialty physicians in Canada for about 15 years. And what's the drum that we've beaten? Well, we've beaten the drum that the patients told us, that all of these things need to be trained in your finite training program. So now not only do you have that doubling of medical technology, et cetera, but now you got to teach all this stuff. So, you know, we're the Royal College, right? We're really smart. We came up with all these things. How have we done? Well, this is what our report card looks like 15 years later. Medical expert continues to be the dominant thing we teach, and that's not surprising because that's what we've done for decades, for centuries. Now we need to start looking at how we're going to embrace all those other things. And it's important because we know that just because you're an expert in one thing, it doesn't necessarily mean you're an expert in everything, right? So how are we going to teach all of these other competencies and do all of these, address all of these barriers that I just talked about? Well, the good news is we've got a lot of different things at our disposal, right? Podcasts, e-learning, PBLs, role modeling, simulation, all in there. What's the bulk of what we do? I know we got a bunch of convertees in a bit of a cult here, right? But what do? 90 to 95% of the way we educate still is in classrooms like this with some joker like me standing at the front with some laptops open down there, although not today, and people taking notes. And this is what's happening as the hamster is not running on the wheel, I can assure you. So even if the eyes are open, this is what's happening behind the eyes. So how are we going to maybe move in the direction that we want to move? And simulation is one of those things. So what is this simulation for? Because I know we have a very heterogeneous audience here. Well, Webster's calls it the imitative representation of one system or process by means of another. A very generic dictionary definition, right? David Gaba is one of the forefathers of simulation, and he gives us a better thing. And it's important because I know there's all sorts of people who are just starting with simulation here, and it's an education technique. It's not about the fancy toys that I'm about to show you. It's not about the technology. It's an educational technique that brings people together and replicates a true clinical environment in a real way. We think that medical simulation, modern medical simulation, got to start with this old girl. Anyone recognize SWAhN from your swimming class? You'd pull her out of the water, you'd do mouth to mouth, then the teacher would clean her off with some pool water and the next kid would go. Yeah. Medical simulation took a little while. The fancy dolls, et cetera, or fancy mannequins took a while, but standardized patients are part of simulation as well, and they're ingratiated into all of our healthcare training programs, right? We use them for training. In some of our fields, we use them for formative and summative assessment. We have part-task trainers that have come to the forefront. Dimitri Anastakis is here, did some of the seminary work at the beginning. Whether you could learn on these part-task trainers, how to give injections, how to suture. And the real question we have to ask ourselves about these part-task trainers beyond can we teach with these things or do they make a difference to our patients? Well, that's the kind of work that's coming out now, the translational work. Look at this model for learning how to insert central lines. Does learning on this change our outcomes for our patients? You bet it does. Jeff Barczyk and the group down at Harvard has done some of the first work in showing changes in patients. And without reading this, what he's done is shown if you learn how to put a central line in on this mannequin, you reduce the number of catheter-infected days in your ICUs when you compare it to a reasonable cohort. So we're starting to show not only is this better for teaching and learning, but it makes a difference on our patients. What about these fancier simulators? And I know we have some gaming people here, like this one to learn about gallbladder surgery. Does learning on a video, on a virtual reality haptic feedback device like this make a difference? Well, Gunnar Ahlberg in Europe and Tidor Grancharov, who's with Dimitri in Toronto, have done some of the work in this area. And look what they've done. They actually took trainees to the operating room. They decided on a certain number kind of errors that happen in this particular procedure. And look at Gunnar Ahlberg's results on the top. A significant reduction in the group that learns on the virtual reality trainer. And Tidor's group below, you can see a significant reduction again in the errors when comparing from pre-test to a post-test control group versus the virtual reality group. So again, making difference on patients. Now, I had to put this one in because John's here and he's a urologist. So, you know, it used to be in Toronto. Dimitri's got big, deep pockets in Toronto. What if you don't have those kinds of things? Can you learn with this, a lower fidelity model? Do you need all these fancy tools? Look at this model for learning endourological stone retrieval. The high fidelity model on the left, and my friend Eddie Matsumoto constructed the model on the right. Now, John might need to walk us through this, but I think this is the penis, this is the bladder, the styrofoam cup, and these McDonald's straws are the ureters. Can you learn how to do a basket stone retrieval on this device? Again, you bet you can. Look at this. Look at the difference between traditional training in yellow and learning on a low fidelity model like the one you see there in the red, or the one on the right in green, the higher fidelity models. The training is equivalent. Particularly important when you look at the difference in the cost of these two models, with the high fidelity model retailing around $4,000 and the lower at 20 bucks. And I often joke with Eddie, I'm not really sure where those $20 went. I think maybe you had to buy the Big Mac Happy Meals to get the McDonald's straws or something. And what about the higher fidelity full body mannequin models? Well, again, and this video is not going to play, I apologize, but what you see here, you don't even see the mannequin. Why? Because the mannequin is the most unrealistic part of the simulation. The most important parts is recreating the environment. The environment where you can learn how to take a patient off a bypass. You have the anesthesiologist there. You have your surgeon here. You have your perfusionist here. You have the nurse off the screen. So that you can practice not the medical expertise of how to take a patient off bypass, but all that communication, all that collaboration that needs to occur. In a study that we did, we looked at that exact question. We did this on real patients. Could you learn how to take a patient off a bypass in a simulator, compared it to traditional training? And what you see here is our normal group, or our control group in the yellow, our group that learned in the simulator in the red. Both were the same at baseline, and you see a significant improvement on taking a real patient off a bypass. And importantly, that learning stuck later. So why does all this work, right? What are the 4 not-so-secrets of simulation? You know, the vice president talked a little bit about why simulation is important, reinforcing, but why is it, how does it work? Well, it's the secrets of pattern recognition, it's engaging the emotions in the learning, it's the power of debriefing, and the importance of deliberate practice. Now, pattern recognition, Glenn Regehr tells us, and Jeff Norman, that it's the probability and efficiency of retrieving an item from your memory. Now, what they tell us is you're more likely to be able to retrieve that item from your memory if it was encoded in a similar situation. Now, that's a lot of cognitive psych mumbo jumbo, right? What does it really mean? It means that I can expose a trainee to this rhythm, or this rhythm, or this rhythm, or any rhythm I think they'll need to know in order to manage patients in a simulation. I can expose them to any rhythm that they may not see in a finite training program. But more important, I can expose them to that rhythm in a context-sensitive environment. During an operation where this rhythm occurs. During a part of the operation where this rhythm occurs. So that when they see it, they'll recognize it as ventricular fibrillation. Simulation engages our emotions in learning. This is the circumplex of emotions and learning. And by having a positive effect, we can get constructive learning through awe, satisfaction, curiosity. Oh, okay, that's a bit of a problem. That's not going to be good. Do you have any? Okay, thanks for engaging in my simulation. So, what I'm trying to show you there is a little shock, a little puzzlement, a little confusion also causes constructive learning in zone 2. Negative emotions aren't always bad. Surprising people isn't always bad. Making them uncomfortable isn't always bad. How do we keep them from slipping into zone 3 and zone 4? That's through debriefing. Okay? Simulation works heavily on the Kolb learning cycle. We have a participant participate in their simulations. They then have the debriefing, an opportunity to reflect and interpret on what they've learned. They can then compare it to their existing logic, form a new way of thinking about it. But the beauty of simulations, they can go back into the simulator again and again and again until they're ready to take it into practice. We know we cannot get rid of this debriefing phase, and it's the most important part. Study that our group did a while back was looking at that exact question, taking people from simulation to simulation. Does learning get conferred? Look at that. No way. Not only did they not get better, they got a little bit worse. You need some form of debriefing, either oral debriefing or a video to help you in that debriefing. And for those of you who doubt the power of video and watching yourself, you probably never had your golf swing analyzed. Because if you haven't had your golf swing analyzed, you don't realize that if an instructor can tell you all day and night to keep that left arm straight, but until you see it in a video, you don't really fully appreciate it. Oh, it froze up. That's too bad. All right, I'm going to go on. But it was a really funny swing. And last but not least, my mentor, Richard Resnick, often quotes Vince Lombardi. It's not practice that makes perfect, but perfect practice that makes perfect. And that's what simulation offers. Anders Ericsson tells us it takes a certain number of hours at anything, shooting a puck at a net, playing your violin, anything to move from being somewhat novice at something to being somewhat fairly expert. Well, that tipping point's somewhere around 100 hours. And you know, I'd rather that 100 hours be spent in a simulation center than on one of my loved ones. At the end of the day, what we're all trying to do in the room for our trainees is work them through the mastery asymptote, right? What I'm arguing is that with all the barriers in front of us and all the changes in front of us, that simulation can accelerate us through the steep part of this learning curve.
Tell them to set up OR6 immediately and contact anesthesiologist Isadora Turk, 472-2112, B12. Have them send an ambulance with a paramedic crew, light IV, D5 and W, and KBO. You got it?
Yeah, North Bay General Hospital, 910,000, Senate, OR6 contact. Anesthesiologist Isadora Turk, 472-2112, B12. Ambulance with paramedics and light IV, D5 and W, KBO.
That's good.
Sounds like a subdural hematoma to me.
Oh, it does, doesn't it? Well, it's not your job to diagnose.
But I
You thought, just go! 3 years of nursing school, you think you know it all. You're still wet behind the ears. It's not a subdural hematoma, it's epidural. Ha! God damn it, makes me mad.
So a cute little video to highlight that I'm not, and I'm sure everyone in this room is not arguing that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Simulation is not here to replace our clinical training. That is always going to be an important part of our medical training. Simulation is going to accelerate us through the steep part of that learning curve so that when your trainees arrive in the clinical setting, they're now on the flat part of that learning curve where they can work on their expertise as opposed to just being comfortable in the clinical setting. Eventually, we hope that they get where all of us are, right? At the very tip of this, where we're getting closer and closer to mastery, right? John's been doing this for a long time. That's where you live, right, John, at the top? Well, this is where we also can say that simulation can affect our continuing professional development. Because I'm afraid the mastery asymptote doesn't really look like that, right? It looks something more like this, right? And like it or not, we know that mastery does fall off because physiology happens, different things happen. And if you really look at what that mastery asymptote probably looks like at a more micro level, it looks something like this. You get peaks and slumps, you have successes, you have failures, and then as you start getting closer to the top of that curve, you start having expertise. So in our daily practice as practicing healthcare professionals, we live there. We have little peaks and valleys, good days, bad days, things that we do routinely. But what about the things we don't do routinely? If we don't manage those traumas routinely, if we don't manage those cardiac arrests routinely, those emergency C-sections for something more rare routinely, we slide back down the mastery asymptote. Simulation's not just for our trainees, it's for all of us. It's for all of us to practice those rare but critical events. And nothing highlighted that more than what just happened in Ottawa, where we use simulation to practice our traumas on a regular basis because a code orange is never going to happen, right? Yeah, we didn't think so in Ottawa either, because we never had a code orange until that bus incident on Thursday. So simulation helps continuing professional practitioner as well as the trainee. And the reason, at the end of the day, I think, we go back to the past all the time, is you hear, you forget, you see, you remember, but if you're doing it, if you're living it, you're understanding it. So now I'm going to shift very quickly to patient safety, because this is the heart of where you want to embed this network. Simulation and patient safety have lived apart for too long. Simulation has to be a part of patient safety, because everything is about patient safety. And the reason patient safety has become right to the forefront is because to err is human, right? I'm sure we'll hear some figures from the United States, but in Canada, we know from Ross Baker's work that 1 out of every 10 hospital admissions will result in an adverse event. 1 out of every 10 hospital admissions. And one third to 1/2 of those events were highly preventable. It led the Institute of Medicine in the States long ago, a decade ago, to say simulation should be leveraged to start addressing some of these things by letting teams work together. Now, hospital administrators, boards, they often ask, how bad is this problem? How rare is rare that we need simulation involved in our healthcare delivery system in order to manage these rare events? Well, the number 1 in 10,000 comes up. People say, well, there's a 1 in 10,000 chance of this happening and we got to be prepared for it. But what does 1 in 10,000 really mean? Well, I decided to Google it. Well, you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of bowling a perfect game, just so you know. You have a 1 in 10,000 chance of becoming a pro athlete, and you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of being injured by a toilet. And I'm not really sure what that's all about. I tried to click the link, but it just didn't seem to work. But there's also a 1 in 10,000 chance of taking off from New York, having a bird, theoretically what they think, fly into your engine and forcing a landing on the Hudson River. And many of you probably know the story of Captain Sully. And Captain Sully tells us that and attributes simulation directly for the reason that he could land that plane and get all those people off. And more important, going back to the original principles, he doesn't just attribute simulation for knowing which way to move the joystick or whatever the yoke in the cockpit, but more importantly, that he practiced how to manage his crew, how to manage the flight attendants, how to organize the emergency, not only to land that plane, but to organize the passengers and the crew to get them all off safely. Aviation in general states that simulation is one of the reasons you've seen this dramatic decline in onboard casualties. So much so that while I tell you that I can be admitted to hospital 10 times and probably one of those times I'm going to have an adverse event, I can tell you that I can fly every day for the next 158 years of my life and not have a flight incident. 1 in 10,000 is what we call a low frequency but a high risk event. And 1 in 10,000 is also the chance of coming in for routine surgery with an anesthesiologist as a healthy patient and having an adverse event. I'll give you one more video to watch.
Dad to 2 young children, Victoria and Adam, and this is the story of the death of my wife, Elaine, who died in March 2005 as a result of an attempted routine operation that went wrong. I'm an airline pilot with a background in human factors.
Very good health, but she had suffered from some sinus problems, and as a result, a consultant had recommended that she should have routine sinus surgery. That when Elaine had been anaesthetised, her airway had collapsed, that the oxygen levels in her body had fallen to very low levels, and so they decided that the safer option was to let Elaine wake up naturally, and unfortunately she hadn't done so.
Fit, they tried a second mask.
Any problems here? Roll down a bit. Let me push the head back a bit more.
They then tried some extra drugs to try and reduce some suspected tension in the muscles in the jaw. So it was obvious almost straight away that things were going wrong. The patient, my wife, is blue. Her oxygenation is 40% or lower, and it has been for 6 minutes. The anaesthetist has 16 years experience, and he is regarded as diligent by his colleagues. The ENT surgeon has over 30 years experience. The other anaesthetist has additional skills pertaining to difficult airways, and 3 of the 4 nurses are all experienced in their job. There was certainly a loss of awareness, an awareness of time, but also an awareness of the seriousness of the situation. If you like, the awareness of what was happening wasn't shared by each of the consultants. At the inquest, 2 of the 4 nurses stated that they knew exactly what needed to happen, but again, to quote from the inquest, didn't know how to broach the subject. We have a breakdown of leadership, of situational awareness, of prioritisation, of decision making, of communication, and of assertiveness. And these same factors, these same human factors, ironically, are present in 75% of aviation accidents.
Human factors tells us that actually we're all wrong no matter how good we are, and we need people around us to help us. It's creating that open environment within your colleagues, being open to suggestions. If they put their hand up and say, excuse me, I'm not sure about this, it's not turning around and saying, actually, I'm the boss here. It's turning around and saying, tell me what your concern is. It's listening.
So a powerful video, and I encourage you to all look at it. It's available on YouTube. It's much longer than that. But it shows how simulation is potentially a platform to start breaking down these hierarchies and start closing these loops of communication and collaboration. And a lot of you may say, okay, I understand, maybe a smaller facility, not the mighty UH or the mighty St. Joe's in London. Well, we ran this exact scenario with anesthesiologists and an OR team at St. Mike's before I left. And look at these results, and these are just some of them. Looking at the anesthesiologist specifically, failure to call for help. 1/3 of people failed to call for help even. 20% failed to ask for surgical help as this can't intubate, can't ventilate situation evolved. And 75% deviated from what we knew to be best practice in managing the situation. So simulation is not just for our trainees as you start to think about this network. It's for all of us in improving the health in the Southwest region. And why is that? Because for too long, and Lorelei Lindgaard I know isn't here, but some of the work she is doing is starting to address the fact that we all think about our little silos, nursing, medicine, healthcare, as individuals. What are the individual competencies versus the team competencies? And this tension needs to be resolved. Because if I put a list of people up like this, right? Does anyone know who these list of people are? Absolutely, okay? List of no names, right? You haven't heard of them, no one's coming to the thing. Arguably the greatest team ever assembled. Highlighting how important it is to focus on team competence as opposed to individual competence. Especially highlighted when I put this list of individuals up, right? Anyone recognize that list of individuals? Right? The great shame of Athens, right? Bronze medal. Tremendously competent individuals, but couldn't come together as a team. Even as much as I've touted this framework and all the wonderfulnesses in it, it still focuses on the individual physician, not on teams. As we see more competency frameworks develop, around the UK, the US, they all look very similar. But again, the physicians are centered in this, right? It's about the medical expert and the physician, the communication and the physician. We need to shift that. Our own Canadian Patient Safety Institute has tried to do that. They're starting now to develop, they've developed competencies for the team. And this should probably be the more important framework that we start embracing in the care of our patients. I'm going to close now and just say that simulation, if we gauge it against Kirkpatrick's hierarchy of whether it's a useful education, change modality, you can gauge it along these various things: reaction, changes in attitudes and perceptions, knowledges and skills, behaviors, organizations, and benefit to our patients. Well, I think the problem with simulations, we've lived for a long time down here. The students came to the simulator, they liked it, they gave it a 5 out of 5, great. Okay, of course they liked it. Better than sitting in here, right? But now I've shown you some evidence that we're starting to change knowledges and skills. I've shown you some evidence that we're starting to change behaviors. And we've seen a change in our organizations. That's why you're all here. In 1999, there were 6 simulation centers in Canada. Our last count, Dimitri's probably got a better one than I do. I think we counted about 140 across Canada. And arguably, you guys are going to build arguably the biggest one that we know of to date. At the end of the day, we're all here, and important that we should be framing our discussion not around building better education system, we're building better care for the patients in the Southwest region. So I'm going to stop there, hope that I've addressed my objectives okay, and leave you with my email. We're always welcome guests. We've had some guests from Western, or from Southwestern group up to Ottawa, and we invite any of you anytime to come see our center and to talk about things further. Thank you. Okay, time?
Thank you very much for it.
How they reacted at certain points during the exercise, because they will have it wrong. If you ask them, well, what did you do? It'll all be perfect and not exactly what happened. How does people in the different specialties, how are they responding to being videotaped, critiqued, the whole bit of the after action review?
So I'll just repeat it quickly. The question was, how are people reacting to debriefing, getting teams together, exposing their performance when debriefing is the most important? First of all, that's a fabulous question, and that's really the barrier to deconstruct, right? From the military, from pilots, it's a culture that's already there, that yes, I'm going to critique your performance. It's not a slight on you. We have a lot, medicine in particular has a lot of type A, driven people who have always been in the top 10% of whatever they're doing, and to tell them that there's something they could be doing better is always a challenge. 2 things. One is that I think it's important that you get all the stakeholders. It doesn't work if you get the nurses and the RTs together and then you have a physician instructor. That doesn't work, right? So now the docs are talking down to the nurses and everybody again from their perspective alone. The other thing that can sometimes, so you get all those people, sometimes role reversal. So get the doc to play in the role of the nurse, get the nurse to play in the role of the doc. Sometimes helps change that perspective a little bit. And the last thing I'll say is a little bit of a culture thing, is we do a tremendous amount of work at the medical schools, I'm sure Western's no different, of interprofessional education. We bring fan shop people and the Western kids together a lot. But then we do a terrible job when they get into the clinical world, because role modeling deconstructs all of that, right? In a heartbeat, right? They spend some time with us in the clinical world, in the operating room, in the critical care unit, and they see, well, this isn't like it was in medical school and nursing school where we did classes together and went to the pub together. This is where he yelled at her, and so that whole role modeling thing needs to change. Until we start getting practicing docs into the simulation center, we're not going to change that culture. It'll continue to revolve. The young ones are actually willing to do it, but they get encultured into our culture. I don't want to use that word too much, and we need to deconstruct that, or it's going to be a failing endeavor. It's incumbent upon me in roles like at the Royal College. We tried a lot of things, carrots mainly. Come to the simulation center, we'll give you more main cert points, etc. I've become a non-believer, and what we're discussing is sticks now. You're going to come to the simulation center because we know you have to come. And ironically, once we get people there, even that can't intubate, can't ventilate with the people at St. Mike's, they actually like, oh, that wasn't horrible. Actually, I learned a lot. So I think it'll build on itself, but we have to get the people there. And the only way we're going to do that is to stick, I think.
NATO. He served as the second most senior military advisor to the NATO Secretary General for many years in Brussels. He certainly was a practical military man as well, logged 3,000 hours as a fighter pilot in the U.S. military. And then after all of that, retired fully in Orlando, Florida. The retirement didn't last too long, I don't think, Tom, and you were recruited back into service in the field of simulation. And now Tom is the president of the and director of the National Center for Simulation in Orlando, Florida. And that's an activity that he's been involved in for 3 years. I was just thrilled when Tom agreed to travel up here and participate in this program. His talk will speak for itself. He's going to talk about government, academic, and business partnerships that exist in Orlando and how it is fostered. I think it's only fair to say a gigantic industry in South Florida based on simulation of various components of that, as we'll hear, not all healthcare. So without further ado, Tom, thanks again for coming up here.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Dr. Denstedt, and everyone, indeed, for allowing me to be part of this today. I want to tell you a little bit of a good news story for Orlando and Central Florida that's taken nearly 5 decades to develop, but I want to highlight some very specific actions taken by academia, industry, and government at the right time to continue to grow what is now the epicenter of the world for simulation and training. Not just in the United States, but this is where the world comes together to develop simulation technology devices and do good things for not only our warfighter, but for a number of emerging opportunities in other sectors of our economy, such as medical simulation, how we train our healthcare providers. So I did spend a couple of years during my 34 years on active duty up in Canada. In 1996, I reported to North Bay here in Ontario. I spent 4 months here, and then my task was to move the North American Aerospace Defense Command headquarters from North Bay to the Air Command headquarters in Winnipeg. So I spent the rest of my 2 years in Winnipeg. As the deputy commander for the Canadian NORAD region, I worked for Al de Quetteville, I worked for Lieutenant General MacDonald, a couple of names that you may know or not, but I learned how to say A. I drank a lot of Canadian beer and still like it. But anyway, it's great to be here. A little bit of background to give you a perspective of where I come from. I was a fighter pilot for 34 years. So I lived through what I like to refer to as an evolution in the quality of simulation. When I first started flying airplanes in the early 1970s, the first fighter plane that I flew was the F-4 Phantom. That aircraft was developed in the 50s. It was fielded in the 60s, and it was the backbone multi-role fighter for the Vietnam conflict for America. Now, I flew that airplane up until the early 1980s when I was selected to become part of the initial cadre of F-16 instructor pilots to phase out the F-4 and phase in the F-16. When you build a new airplane and you field it in large numbers, there are no pilots to fly it because it's only been flown by the test pilots. So they had to take people out of other weapon systems and give them a crash course to learn how to fly the airplane and then train them as instructors in order to receive their first lieutenant out of the U.S. Air Force Academy and teach him how to fly. So I was fortunate to get into the ground floor, and what I like to refer to that is that was a giant leap out of the analog era into the digital age. The capability was like moving out of an Oldsmobile 88 into a Ferrari. I mean, it was dramatically different and unbelievably good airplane. But my simulation experience was, I can put in the really horrible category and then to the really unbelievably good category. In the early days, I can remember part task trainers that were balsa wood boxes with pasted on instrument panels and consoles,
You couldn't plug them in. They didn't make any noise. They didn't do anything. You had to take a folding chair inside the little balsa wood thing, sit down with your checklist, and you could familiarize yourself with the pictures and what the airplane would look like if they'd ever let you actually go out there to the real one. Fast forward to the F-16, you now have a simulator with a visual display that wraps 180 degrees around. It can be networked anywhere in the world. It can be linked to, through distributed mission operations, to a live exercise that you can participate in virtually with real airplanes actually over the skies of Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, in a multi-force, huge training exercise. You can be there in your simulator from Shaw Air Force Base, South Carolina, or any place in the world. So that's the kind of the evolution in the quality. And what drove that, I guess I'd have to credit the power of the computer processor. I mean, we just got to do things neater and better because the computer allowed us to do that. And so industry continues to develop some unbelievably good stuff. Now, is it right click, left click, down, up, right? Okay. So from very humble beginnings that go all the way back to 1965, what has grown to be a $5 billion industry with its epicenter in the center of the research park adjacent to the University of Central Florida, which is the second largest university in America, right there in Orlando. So it wasn't by accident, but I would also say that the city fathers all the way back in 1965 probably couldn't predict the success that would follow. But they were smart enough to do the right things at the right time, and that's how it's grown, and I'll tell you about that. So I got to give you the Economic Development Commission slide here to tell you what the economic impact for Florida is. It's $5 billion a year. And I'll tell you why it's so big. The economic activity is, if you look at everything from buying hamburgers at McDonald's and going to the local bars and other things, it has an $8 billion per year impact on economic output within the state of Florida. 27,000 jobs directly employed by this industry. Total jobs impact somewhere around 61,000. The average salary is more than 2 times the average salary in Orange County, which is highly focused on tourism, as you might imagine. Services industry, which are not necessarily very well paid. But the average salary in this industry across the state is $70,000. Within the research park, it's more than $82,000 per year, which is 2.5 times the average salary in Orange County. So it's a big deal. It's a big economic driver. It's a high-tech economic driver, which is critically important in my mind, because for too long, the economy of Florida was based on tourism, on agriculture, and on home construction. Well, we all know what happened in 2007 and 2008 when the home construction and the value of housing plummeted. Well, we're still trying to claw our way out of that. And one of the keys to getting out of that is to leverage high-tech opportunities such as simulation, such as alternative energy, such as laser, optics, photonics, biomed, biotech. And all those things are there in Central Florida, but you don't know that. We have a critical problem with branding. We say Orlando, you say Disney. Well, that's only half the story. There's high-tech opportunity. It's a great place to live. It's a fun place, but nobody thinks it's a serious place. Well, I'm telling you, this is serious. This is big time serious, and I'm going to tell you how it got to be where it is today. So, why Orlando's Research Park? Well, not only the power of the computer processor, but in 1984, there was a vision to build a research park adjacent to this emerging university. When the University of Central Florida was built back 50 years ago, it was called Florida Technological University. It was built halfway between the Martin Marietta plant, which is now Lockheed Martin, out on the Kirkman Road on the west side of Orlando, and the Space Coast, NASA. The whole purpose of that university was to grow engineers for the space program. Well, it has changed. It's morphed into a full-fledged university with all types of disciplines, not just engineering. And as I said, it's the second largest university in America today with nearly 60,000 students. Well, the city fathers, with this vision of a research park, they're watching what's going on up there in that research triangle in North Carolina and saying, boy, we want some of that. We want to attract the best and brightest, and we want to attract R&D money, and we want to promote our university, and diversify it and grow its capability and make it internationally renowned in certain areas. But they realized that in order to build a research park, you had to have something to anchor the park around. You can't just build it and hope they come. You've got to have something that will attract industry, that will attract research dollars. And when the research dollars start to come, or maybe it's the other way around, if you have the brightest minds there, the research dollars come, but regardless, they feed off of each other. The more research dollars that come, the more the brightest minds will show up and want to be part of it. So they said to the Army and the Navy, who in 1965 had moved from Long Island, New York to the Naval Training Center, which was NTC Orlando, which, by the way, was closed through base realignment and closure in 1995. It doesn't exist anymore. In '84, 11 years prior to that, the city fathers said, Navy will give you 40 acres free of charge to become a center of excellence in the middle of what we hope will become a research park. There was nothing there but orange groves. The reason why the university got the land was because back in that time in 1984, there was a huge housing slump, much like 2007, and a big housing development went belly up. And so the university said, well, we can get all of this land south of the university for pennies on the dollar. Let's buy it. That's where we'll put our research park. So somewhat through luck, they were able to buy the land, and they offered the Navy 40 acres to build a center of excellence. Then Congressman Bill Nelson, who today is the senior senator from the state of Florida, convinced the chief of naval operations to take the option, and they started construction on what is called the DeFlores Complex in 1984. It was completed in '88, and the Army and the Navy moved out of the Naval Training Center out to what was a small little military base called Naval Support Activity Orlando, surrounded by orange groves, with this hope that industry would come, that more business, other types of business would all co-locate themselves in what would become this research park. So it's that environment that goes all the way back to there that facilitated collaboration, cooperation, and partnership between government, represented by the military commands that are there, by local government through the Economic Development Commission, the offices of the mayor of Orlando and Orange County, and academia, embodied by the University of Central Florida, which, oh, by the way, 30 years ago when this was all going on, the university made a conscious decision that there's something special about this simulation stuff. And they established their Institute for Simulation and Training, which is not a classic portion of the university that is funded through the state and salaries of the professors paid that way. It's all research. You got to get the research dollars from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and DIH and other areas. Win those grants in order to continue to fund yourself. And they have now grown. They just celebrated their 30th anniversary. And they were the first university in America to graduate master's degree and doctoral level students in simulation. So they leveraged a growing cluster to build a capability within the university to grow the workforce of the future. And that is fertile recruiting ground today, even today, for the companies that are in the Orlando and Central Florida area that work on simulation in support of the military. We talked about the education thing. Today, the success of this cluster has outgrown that initial infrastructure that was built between 1984 and '88, which creates a critical vulnerability for us today. That space only satisfies half of the space required for the 2,800 federal government employees that work there in support of simulation training and devices for the military. So they spill out in the research park into commercial leased rental real estate. They pay $5.4 million a year in rent, principally the Army and the Air Force presence. And that's a critical vulnerability as we look at what's happening on Capitol Hill. The defense budget of the United States will decline by $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years. We're in the second year of that decline, due not only to the president's budget of FY12, but due to sequestration, which is known as the Budget Control Act of 2011, which essentially doubles the cuts on defense as a measure to try to reduce the deficit spending that has been rampant and to balance the budget and reduce the national debt, which is approaching $17 trillion as we speak. So we've got to do something. Within our community, we realize that this is the next challenge to this cluster. We've got to solve that 200,000 square foot shortfall. It will cost $60 million to do that. But we are building a case today to engage our legislative leaders and to go to the next legislative session in Tallahassee just after the first of the year with a big multi-year request. This isn't build it and they will come. This is a $5 billion per year industry, and $60 million is chump change to save it. If you start to allow the military to move away through realignment as a cost-cutting measure, the Army and the Air Force, as I mentioned, you will start to undermine the fabric of what's taken nearly 5 decades to grow, and that today is a $5 billion, consistently $5 billion per year industry. We talked about academic programs and what the university has done to leverage the simulation cluster as a way to focus its investment, to focus the courses that it offers, and in order to be a strong supporter of growing the workforce that supports this. I talked about outgrowing the current infrastructure, but another graphic example of support from the government, when the jets flew into the Twin Towers in New York on 9/11, the Department of Defense reaction was to leverage very strict force protection requirements on any and all military installations. Vehicle barriers, fencing, surveillance, intelligence assets, all those kinds of things you would expect. You do the same thing in Canada. Well, those people who spill out of the original 40 acres, which is Naval Support Activity Orlando, is a federal enclave. It is federally owned land. It was given to the federal government. But the 200,000 square feet that's occupied outside the fence is not federally owned land. And the federal government is prohibited from developing any land that it doesn't own. So in order to extend the force protection away outside to a second tier, if you will, to protect those buildings where the Army, the Navy, Marines, and some other federal government agencies live in commercial real estate, they had to get those landowners and the building owners to agree to allow their facilities to be fenced in, for vehicle barriers to be placed, for surveillance capability, all the things necessary to meet the Joint Staff Integrated Vulnerability Assessment criteria. Had they not stepped up, the state of Florida, with $9.1 million, we would have started to lose a lot of that government presence. And trust me, industry is there because the government is there and they have $5 billion checkbooks. If you start to see some of Team Orlando leave, you will see industry follow. They will follow the checkbook. They will move, they want to be as close as they can to the customer. They want to have a personal relationship with the customer. They want to demonstrate their past performance to win the next contract. And so it's very important to stay very close to that customer. So this is it. Is there a laser on this? Yeah, the top one. So you see the solid orange or yellow, that is Naval Support Activity Orlando. It was a Navy base, so they built this looks like a wave because it's the Navy, okay? The Navy is fully self-contained in their own base. The Army occupies a very large portion of the annex here, but the Army spills out to occupy half of this building, Research Commons. The Air Force is totally contained within Tech Point 2. The Army fills the rest of Tech Point 1 and Tech Point 2. We have the U.S. Army Research Development Engineering Command Simulation Training Technology Center living in the Smith building up here, which is owned by the foundation, the university's foundation. The Army Research Institute and the Army Research Lab are also located there, not the whole thing, but a portion of those two organizations. The Department of Defense has a facility down here where they do advanced distributed learning called the Advanced Distributed Learning Co-Laboratory. They do intelligent tutor work. They do, e-learning, computer-based kinds of educational and training. They're located down here. And up here, just off the chart, there's the Joint Training, Integration, and Experimentation Center and a couple of other federal small presence that live in lease space as well. So the point I'm trying to make here is we need to figure out how to get people out of here, out of these buildings, into something that is owned by the university. Now, the approach used in the past is the state of Florida built Partnership 1, 2, and 3 through educational infrastructure funding, which is called PICO. They built those buildings and they offer the Department of Defense half of the space. So they occupy 50% of those buildings, and they only pay for the operations and maintenance costs of the square feet that they occupy. So instead of paying $28 per square foot, which is the commercial going rate, they pay $8 a square foot. A better deal than they would get if they lived in here in a Navy-owned building. So again, another graphic example of how local government and the state legislature have stepped forward to graphically demonstrate how important this industry cluster is to Orlando and Central Florida. So what facilitated the close cooperation between academia, industry, and government other than the funding that I've talked about? Well, the military commands, on the center of this chart, took it upon themselves to develop a governance structure. Not because they were directed to, but because they realized they could do things faster, smarter, cheaper. They could share workforce. They could flex technology across service lines. They could exchange best practices. They could do things smarter in order to deliver capability to the military cheaper, faster, and at less program risk. So they organized themselves in what they refer to as Team Orlando. But they went beyond that. They invited the National Center for Simulation, the organization that I head, to sit at the table as an advisor and the voice of industry. They invited the University of Central Florida to sit at the table as the voice of academia. And then they invited local government, the Economic Development Commission. They have an opportunity for state and federal representation through the district offices of our federally elected folks, and from the state, from many of the offices that own pieces and parts of where most of this is, to sit at the table also as an advisor. So it's this collaborative alliance that continues to nurture and inform and do the right kinds of things to make sure we recognize when there's hurdles on the horizon and how it is that we can help to continue to nourish and grow this very powerful industry cluster. We talked about the principal customer for the industry that's littered along the high-tech corridor defined by I-4 from Daytona, the Space Coast through Orlando, all the way to Tampa and St. Petersburg, are still focused on the primary customer being defense. But we've talked about other opportunities. I don't need to tell you that there's a big-time opportunity in medical simulation. 3 things that are going on along the high-tech corridor. South of the airport, the lake known as Medical City is under construction. The anchor point for that is the UCF Medical School. And oh, by the way, every student when they enter the medical school are given an avatar family. And that avatar family ages as they go through their medical school and experiences a number of maladies that they have to deal with over the course of their education. So Deborah German, who is the dean of the medical school, has instituted simulation at the very foundation of what is now UCF's medical school. But that school attracted the Sanford Burnham Research Institute that does diabetes research. There's an MD Anderson Cancer Research Institute there. The University of Florida, from Gainesville, built a research institute in the medical city out there. The first freestanding children's hospital called Nemours was built at the Lake Nona Medical City and is now open. But as you heard from Dr. Denstadt, there are a couple of other initiatives along the high-tech corridor that are game changers within Central Florida that could prove to be a way to drive the future of simulation. and that is out at the Celebration Health facility, which is one of the 23 campuses of Florida Hospital. They have built a 60,000 square foot extension to their robotics surgery training facility, and have now increased the capacity to train 20,000 robotic surgeons every year. Over in Tampa, St. Petersburg, a partnership between the University of South Florida and Tampa General Hospital has built CAMLS, the Center for Advanced Medical Learning and Simulation. It is a hugely high-tech training facility that attracts people to come and use it for their training and simulation purposes. But a remarkable facility. I know, John, you told me that you've visited it, and I haven't visited any up here in Canada, so I can't comment. But it's one of those that they built and hope they will come. I can't tell you what the capacity is for the use of that facility, but it's a pretty remarkable capability. But in education, the way we train our kids, you saw the picture of the earlier speaker of the student slumped over the front of his chair, asleep in the classroom. Putting 95% of your education in a room like this with a gray-haired guy like me and PowerPoint slides, that's not it. That's not what the kids want. They want to be engaged. They want to be immersed. They want to have fun while they learn. So, and technology is giving us the capability to do that with mobile applications. The power of your iPhone is more powerful than the first mainframe that was developed and probably has more storage. So think about that. That's a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week training and educational tool. Now, my eyes are weak, so I don't want to use the iPhone. I'd rather have an iPad or something a little bit bigger so I can see it. But my point being, the combination of different technologies in the classroom training is going to, I think, reshape the way we deliver education. Now, we can't ever get rid of the classroom, because I certainly don't want another generation of kids that can't do anything but look at an iPhone and move their thumbs. They still need to be able to socially look someone in the eye and communicate. And one of the limitations of most college graduate, that's probably overstated. We see a problem with college graduates' ability to communicate, both verbally and written is usually the biggest limitation. So when they go to Lockheed Martin looking for a job, in many cases they require a lot of training. They require a lot of training and communication in both oral and written. But transportation, homeland security, the way you train first responders to an earthquake is no different than training a large formation of soldiers. You use a constructive simulation driven by a scenario that's computer-based. The injects drive responses from the people who are participating, and then the next steps in the exercise are driven by those injects and how they respond. So you can do that. You just change the scenario from force-on-force combat to a hurricane, an earthquake, or whatever the natural disaster of your choice. But there's huge opportunities for us to get homeland security out of the dark ages and start to think about using simulation in a much bigger way. Digital media, serious games, and entertainment. I understand there are a couple of gaming companies that are in the audience. The military recognizes in a big way the power of gaming. Gaming spun off of the military simulation industry, if you will, back in the day, but is now so powerful it feeds technology back to DoD. The use of a game engine that runs a game for fun that all the kids are playing can be repopulated with serious material to develop a serious training and educational tool. Immersive environments, avatar technology. You can immerse a soldier or a group of soldiers in an environment driven by a game engine, and then you don't need 10,000 acres of range space. They're in an immersive environment that looks just like Iraq, just like Afghanistan. And the avatar can act as an indigenous personnel that they have to interact with. They can make shoot, don't shoot decisions. They can decide how it is that they're going to operate their tactics based on this virtual environment. So there are huge opportunities in more interaction with the gaming industry. I see in the industry companies that I represent today a much changed workforce. 10 years ago, you would have gone into a simulation company whose primary customer was DoD, the military, and you would see a very conservative group of folks, maybe in a long sleeve shirt and a tie, or even a jacket and tie. Today you go there and there's going to be some people with orange hair and earrings and other things like that. They're the gamers. They're the people that are, just incredibly creative. And that is an opportunity to make simulation better. Entertainment, the storytelling of Hollywood. When you think about putting that into the mix of your simulation, you can make it hyper-realistic. You can make the experience for the young soldier so real that when he gets off the C-17 in Baghdad, he thinks he's back at the training center at 29 Palms because he's seen it before. He's not afraid. Sights, smells, role players, all those things make the simulation hyper-realistic. So all of those things, we're starting to see more synergy between those types of sectors in our economy, and Orlando is trying to capitalize on that by building what they call the Creative Village. It's a downtown initiative. It'll be focused on digital media, gaming, and entertainment. But because of the strong presence of the simulation industry there, we see tremendous opportunity for collaboration, cooperation, and partnership in making those things a much bigger part of the future. So, back in 1965, it was a simple world out there in that Naval Training Center. The Army and the Navy lived together, operating under a joint agreement that says, thou shalt cooperate on training, technology, and applications. And now that's a simplified version of what it probably says. But the point being, they were there, and in exchange for dollars, the simulation industry produced products and services. Well, fast forward today. This is what it looks like at the $5 billion level. The Army and the Navy have been joined by the Air Force, the Marines, the Coast Guard, and 10 other federal government agencies and joint commands, all co-located in that environment of the Central Florida Research Park. They still exchange dollars for delivered products and services to meet the requirements of our military services. But industry recognizes there's opportunities out here. So their products and services are going out that door directly to other sectors of the economy. And it takes a very powerful educational system to grow the workforce of the future, to drive through our 2-year programs the technicians that manage or maintain the simulated devices. Through the 4-year programs, graduates that can enter at the very entry level with our industry there in Central Florida. And then, of course, through research and postgraduate degrees and those types of things, and through the Institute of Simulation and Training, they're doing some of the cutting edge research that's advancing the state of the art of simulation and exploring those things we haven't even thought about. So it's a very powerful ecosystem that's much more complex today than it was back in 1965. So, simulation and training technologies are good for America. They're good for Canada. They make our warfighters that much better, and they make them safer. And hopefully it brings more home than if we didn't have very robust training programs that include simulation. Orlando is the epicenter of not just the United States, but indeed the world. And it's taken a concerted effort by academia, industry, and government, that three-legged stool that is so very powerful. If you want to make a big step, it has to be a public-private partnership. If you want to do it on your own, industry wants to do it on their own, they'll take tiny little steps, and it'll take a long time. But if you want to be bold, then you got to bring together all 3 legs of that stool. That's what it takes to do things that are big, dramatic, and have unbelievable effect. Co-location, collaboration, cooperation. And we see opportunities starting to unfold or emerge in other sectors, which I think is a good thing for the companies that I represent, because they shouldn't be so dependent on just a military contract. DoD's we're going to live through some very, very austere budgets for the next decade in the Department of Defense. And so those companies who can find a way to diversify their customer base, find ways to satisfy Homeland Security, find ways in other non-defense sectors to market their technology, are going to be successful regardless of what happens to defense. But this, in my opinion, what we have down there in Orlando, Central Florida is a strategic national resource. Good for America and good for the warfighter and good for our allies. Thank you.
Maybe a question or two, Tom?
Yeah.
Lane.
University of Central Florida is the University of Central Florida is the linchpin. You've built a medical component, you've got the simulation component, medical has the simulation. What about other educational institutions? So if you go up the corridor to Daytona, then you've got Embry-Riddle. Does Embry-Riddle tie into this? And
Embry-Riddle, yeah. I don't have, at the National Center for Simulation, I don't have as close a relationship with Embry-Riddle as I would like to have. And I don't know why that is. I'm trying to fix that through some acquaintances that have very strong ties to the senior leadership at Embry-Riddle. But the way I see it is the same thing was true for NASA. NASA was very insular. They didn't think they needed anybody until they announced closure of the space shuttle and lost 8,000 jobs over in Brevard County. Embry-Riddle also is very insular, it would appear to me. They cooperate with industry, but they don't plug into Central Florida and Orlando as actively as I think they should. And we're going to see if we can fix that. But right now, the relationship is not as strong. UCF is clearly the closest partner of the industry and as well as the National Center for Simulation.
What about Florida Tech?
There are a number of what used to be two-year programs that are now, almost everything is morphing into a four-year program. And there are a number of those who support nursing programs, that support other technical kinds of graduates that plug in and support through workforce and workforce development the industry. But again, the relationship, they're still trying to find a way, how do we in a much bigger way try to leverage this proven economic cluster? And they struggle with that. And we try to help, but it's tough. Now I will tell you, we do a lot of work at the National Center for Simulation with STEM education, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And we're at the middle school level, at the high school level, we've developed a 4-year high school curriculum based on simulation that is free to any high school that would like to use it. The biggest challenge we have are the teachers to teach it because they're afraid of the technology. And it's not part of their educational system. We're trying to work with the University of Central Florida Department of Education to try to figure out how to maybe do like a minor or something that focused on STEM, on robotics, on simulation, on optics, photonics, those kinds of things, so that they can be the teachers, and we can bring industry mentors to help them. But somebody's got to have got to be the focal point if we're going to do that at each of the middle school and the high school level. But we have relationships with a number of magnet schools across Orange and Seminole County that where we help them with their curriculum, and we do field trips, we send mentors from the industry out there to help them. But it's if you can't get them in the middle school, I think at the third grade, if they don't like math, you've lost them. So we really need to be at that level to get them excited about pursuing a STEM degree and using this opportunity as a future employment opportunity. Educate them in Florida and keep them in Florida. It's the same thing. You don't want to lose your best graduates to go somewhere else. Well, we don't either. And we've got to feed that beast. That beast has got a tremendous appetite for quality people. And it continues to grow.
Delve in just a moment. Tom, can you, I asked you last evening of this whole enterprise in Orlando, Florida, what % is military versus healthcare, which of course is our focus here. And the answer was 95%.
And that might be over exaggerated, but
it's big.
Yeah, it's big.
Can you describe the interface between the whole military thing and the healthcare simulation industry in Florida?
The opportunities with the military and with the U.S. Department of Defense are still huge. So it's hard to wean those industry companies that have built themselves on opportunities with the government. So their focus is still there. When I think about medical simulation and the future, the problem and we've touched on this with previous speakers, who defines the requirement? Industry responds to a defined requirement that they can understand and know that they have core competencies that can satisfy that requirement. And the other thing they want to know is that there's money behind it, or else they're not going to get excited. So the problem with most industry companies is they think that medical simulation is a big opportunity on the near-term horizon, but they don't know who sets the requirements, they don't know how big it is, so they're conservatively staying away from it. They're not going to spend a third of their business practice towards something that's too uncertain. Now, CAE solved that right here by buying their way into it. You know, if you're big enough, you can go buy Medi. You can go buy Presagis. You can go buy a number of other proven small companies that are already in the medical space, and you can become a leader through acquisition. Now, they have a great idea, and I believe in it, that you can take the paradigm of how you train a pilot and apply that to surgeons and apply that to anesthesiologists. And that means academic training, ground training, simulation, and then clinical when the time is right. But, you know, in that old paradigm that you still live under, see one, do one, teach one, I don't want to be the middle guy. Do you? You know, I'd rather he go do that with a high-priced mannequin or through team training or through other types of simulation rather than waiting for me to come through the door and lay on the table and then I'd be the one that is the do one. So my point being, the cluster is still heavily focused on the DoD customer. But there are opportunities in medical simulation that some companies are starting to, you know, to spin off some of their business practice. But, you know, it's still not as big as I'd like to see.
Dale Henderson.
If we wanted to create a simulation north, what would be the first move to help copy what you're doing and add to what you're doing from the point of view of Canadian input to the successes?
Okay, well, we were very fortunate in that the military decided to place itself in Central Florida. So that was the nucleus. And the predictable funding that came with the Department of Defense and the requirements of all of our services was just like honey to industry. So the government piece was the real catalyst. And industry came because they realized that there was requirements and there was money behind the requirements. And they wanted to be as close as possible. The academia piece was built. I mean, the University of Central Florida made a conscious decision to build that capability, to leverage an opportunity to create an institute within its own university that focused on simulation and training, advancing the state of the art, advanced research projects, those kinds of things, in support of not only the military, but other opportunities. So they did that part. So I think you need all three of those pieces in order to have that very powerful three-legged stool. The National Center for Simulation, I don't talk about NCS. I talk about the industry in hopes that somebody will ask me, well, what do you do? The National Center for Simulation was stood up in 1993 as the Training and Simulation Technology Consortium. It was based upon a White House reinvestment grant that required Martin Marietta, the largest defense contractor in Florida, and his best friends, and academia and local government to match a certain amount of funding. The organization was stood up, and the entire focus of what they were, the reason they existed, was to try to find ways to spin off the technology that the government had spent a lot of money on and developing through R&D to other applications other than defense. So it was all about what we're talking about. How can we make the average housewife's life better by leveraging some of this technology that's proven in support of defense, but we want to apply it across America? Well, it was a dismal failure. Great idea, timing wasn't right. And the reason why I think the timing wasn't right was because the appetite of defense on more aggressively implementing simulation as part of the training curricula, as solving some of those training requirements at a very much reduced cost, being able to do things in a risk-free environment over and over and over and over again before you let that tank gunner get in the tank or that aircraft driver to get in the airplane. So I think that's why it didn't work then. We're seeing more of an opportunity for that today. But what happened as a result of that is I think the organization was about 22 strong at the time. It was heavily weighted with engineers who were doing research to try to define ways to do exactly what their mandate was. Well, it's now 3 people. It's me, I have an executive assistant, and I have an operations director. A year ago, I only had 2, myself and an executive assistant. So we represent 221 members, and I'm the principal advocate, the cheerleader. I'm an evangelist. I talk about the power of simulation. And even when you look at the austere budget environment we're in today, simulation is more important than ever because you can't afford to do live training. It's too expensive. So the balance between live and simulation is going to change because of the budget reality. They're going to start to get closer. Now, I'm not telling you that you can replace all live training with simulation. I was a fighter pilot. You can't have one of my hours to be replaced by a simulator. But the budget reality will do that. So we've got to be more innovative in how it is that we apply simulation. We've got to balance the live and simulated training. We've got to figure out what we do with simulation and what we do in the top-off of the real airplane. And I'm sorry I use aviation examples because that's what I'm comfortable with. But you can apply that to any type of specialty across the DoD. So we support STEM education. We support business development. I do a lot of connecting the dots. I attract a number of international companies to establish a presence, to plug in. And NCS can be the person who connects the dot for them. I can introduce them to consultants who can be their boots on the ground if that's what they want. And then ultimately, we want to see them open an office, just like Semagon from Israel did, just like CAE from Canada did over in the Tampa area, and they've got a presence in the research park as well. So it's business development, STEM education, supporting communication, outreach. I spend a lot of time with elected officials. Simulation doesn't roll off the tongue. Those who are not involved, you say simulation and their eyes go. If you explain to them Microsoft Flight Sim, then they go, oh yeah, I know what that is. Or if you show them a flight simulator or a picture, then they get it. But it's not all about devices. It's team training, it's constructive simulation, it's live, virtual, and constructive. So most people get what a flight simulator looks like and what it's used for, but they don't get a lot of the rest of it. So that takes a lot of education and information of elected officials to realize how powerful this is and how important it is to make sure we preserve it. Protect it, grow it, and enhance it. Sorry.
That's okay, Tom. Thanks. It's a good message to take back to the council there, Dale. You just heard it. Okay, thanks again, Tom.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. So we'll take a break now for about 15 minutes.